Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Let's Talk Comics. This is the first episode of this show, and if you're asking why it's the second, real quick history lesson for you. There is a trailer on the podcast feed that you can listen to that gives you the full breakdown on what the show is and what it's going to be about. But the TLDR is basically this. My name is Jim Viscardi. I used to do this very show 10 years ago, where I spoke to some of the biggest names in the business about the business and how to break in and how to stay in. And it ran for 60 plus episodes, and I loved it, and it was great. And then life happened, and then I had to stop. And now I'm back, and I'm back with someone who I feel privileged to be able to call a friend, someone who was the first guest on my show the first time around. That person is Rick Remender. In my opinion, Rick is probably one of the most influential comic book writers of the modern era. He has an output that is prolific, whether it is Fear Agent, or Black Science, or Deadly Class, 7 to Eternity, or Uncanny X-Force, or the man has a laundry list of great books. This is a guy that creates stories that are bold, emotional, and often asks the big questions, right? The big questions about life and loss, what it means to be human. And so today, as of the time of this recording, he has a book coming out called Seasons with artist Paul Azaceta. And we're going to talk about that book, but we're going to catch up with Rick, basically, about what his career has kind of looked like over the last couple of years, over the last decade since I last spoke to him. And we're going to talk about what the future looks like with Rick. He's a guy who continues to push the boundaries of what comics can do, and Seasons is no exception to that rule. And I think the most interesting thing I love about Rick's work is he creates very complex, multi-layered characters. And in order to do that, you have to be one yourself. And so stick around as we chat about his journey, the stories that keep him up at night, and what's next for one of the most visionary writers in this business. If you're ready, I'm ready. Let's talk comics. Rick, welcome.
Hi, Jim.
The last time we did this, you were just starting Deadly Class, and I feel like you have had 2 careers since then. You have put out 2 careers worth of books since then, and that was only the end of 2013.
Yeah, I had some catching up to do. I don't know. Yeah, it's probably a lot of mental dysfunction, and I look back on the last 10 years, and I go, I see the books sometimes, and I unfortunately realize no matter how good they are, or how wonderful the artist, or how much I worked myself to death, as soon as they're done, I just go, next, next, next. And my wife took the 7 to Eternity big hardcover when it came out. And she's like, it's so beautiful. And she set it up. Right here. That's the one. And she set it on the dining room table. And she's an interior decorator, so she's got it with a bunch of nice Taitian books and all these other things. And there it is. She goes, look, it lives with all of these other beautiful art books. Are you proud of that? And I go, I am, but it's the next thing. It's but I did that already. Like, what's next?
Here's the thing. I've told multiple people that one of the things I love about your books in particular is when you put out those hardcovers, they look phenomenal. Like they look phenomenal on a shelf with the cover facing out. The spines look great, and I love for the ones that you've got multiple volumes of, like there's a nice cohesion to them all. They all, like I said, they all just look so great. And so I guess I'll just ask, like, when you're doing that, when you're for your collected editions and things like that, how much thought process kind of goes into that, if at all? Like, how will this look spine out on a shelf, or
I mean, a lot of that. Yeah, it's all inspired by what I have on my shelf, and looking at the Incal and the Jodorowsky and Mobius on there, and the beautiful design, and it's elegant and clean, and I wanted to make things that were evergreen and lasted, because comics can feel like it can feel like there's a hurricane, a tornado of
Sure.
pamphlets every month, every 30 days, 700 pamphlets explodes. And how do you stand out from that? And the things that mattered, I realized, always ended up in hardcovers on my shelf.
Hmm.
And so when there was enough of a demand and people wanted the work, I wanted the books to be worthy of that.
Hmm.
From, starting with, early in my career, that was the dream. And that meant, the books take 5 times longer to make a lot of the times. And people get pissed off because there's, big gaps between arcs. But when it's all said and done and they're all completed, here we are in the future, all of those slight delays in order to allow the brilliant artists to do their things,
Yep.
they don't really add up to a whole lot. It really comes down to what is on that. And so we spend an extraordinary amount of time designing them and pouring love into them and arm wrestling on it. And everybody shows up and does new art and tries to turn it into something like this is sort of the culmination of all of this work in one final format for the people who love it. And we've kept the prices on them. They're still priced at like 2009 prices. We charge 50, $60 for them, which doesn't make any sense at all. But like in my head, I'm still hearing Ian Mackay give me lectures from Discord Records, like $4 tickets to shows, $10 albums, and how the Fugazi, it spoke to me so much, the integrity when
Hmm.
they turned down MTV and they had all these opportunities to charge more money but didn't. Um, they're just pieces of me that I picked up growing up in that scene, and those hardcovers are. I always just wanted to make things that if I got hit by a bus and my kids one day were like, oh, let's read the old man's work. They'd be like, this is really impressive. It's a beautiful thing.
Right. No, I love that. Uh, you're looking back a bit on your career. You are basically about to celebrate 25 years of Giant Generator, and I feel like I made the joke earlier. I feel like you're at a point with your career now that we can kind of break it down into eras, in a sense, right? We've got so just humor me for a second. We've got you breaking in and a lot of your early independent work and stuff that you did there. Then we've got so there's era one. We'll get back to naming them maybe in a second.
Hold on,
Your
Jim. I'd like you to name them.
your second one is obviously your early your early work for hire stuff at Marvel, where you were still doing creator owned stuff at the time, but then I feel era three is the kind of the last of your work for hire stuff, and when you really started to begin to amp up a lot of the creator owned stuff, obviously with like the starting probably with around Deadly Class, and then now we're in we're like I feel like fully in the full steam ahead Giant Generator era, because not only have you been putting out a bunch of great stuff just in the last 4-ish years, you've got a roadmap for kind of the next 4-ish as well, it feels like. um, those time periods sound about right
Ish.
if we
I don't
break them
know.
up.
I guess it started like
Well,
the first.
I
I've been making comic books since I was in second grade, but the
right,
first ones that we
sure,
published that anybody saw were uh, Captain Dingleberry and
right.
Blackheart Billy and Doll and Creature, and then that
Right.
led into the Image era, and
Mhm.
it is. I do look back on it, and it's getting old is weird. Getting old is weird.
is it is it a thing where when you look back, even just sort of creatively and maybe from a creative process standpoint, how much where do you keep the ideas? Is it a little black book that you just kind of you just keep with you kind of at all times? Is that a thing that you've kept with you your whole career? Is it just a voice note on your
The
iPhone or
little black.
something?
It used to be a black book, and I've
Okay.
got half a closet full of journals that I used to sketch and write stories in, and that's where it used to go. And I think for the past 15 years it's been mostly digital. But I found Deadly Class because I found a journal from 1998, a
Okay.
sketchbook, and I was an animator on Anastasia and Making Captain Dingleberry, and uh, I had an animator I worked with who was Irish, and he would always say like, "Oh, it's fucking Deadly Class, man," and that's like it's a bit of Irish slang, Deadly Class.
Uh-huh.
And I started drawing all these kids, like battle royale stuff, and I'd
Right.
forgotten all about it. And so when I was developing new stuff, I realized I'd fallen so into science fiction, and that was
Mhm.
almost like everyone told me nobody would want science fiction and comic books again in 2004. And so Fear Agent was a lot of like proving that wrong or trying to. And then I just kind of got in that groove and kept doing it. So I developed Low and Black Science coming
Mhm.
out of Fear Agent. And I was starting to work on Tokyo Ghost with Sean. And I was looking for something else, something that was like personal. And I went back to the journal and I found that drawing, the Deadly Class thing. And I'd been working on a thing called Reagan Youth, which was going to be all of my sort of stories of misadventures in the 80s as a punk rock, rascal.
Mhm.
And the two kind of merged to become a thing. Now I've got a pretty intricate file system. So all the stuff that it's in development right now
Mhm.
um, are all projects that I started cooking up between 2018. I think Sacrificers was 2017,
Okay.
but they go back. So what I do is I start with if I have a title or an idea, or Sacrificers was, in order to have everything, a world of plenty, we have to give the rich a child. It's Rumpelstiltskin, and you start thinking,
Mhm.
and it just expands, but it takes years to kind of do that. And then Max comes in and has his input into sort of the world and what it looks like. And so I have a file folder that is, I call it a morgue in case they go there to die. But the morgue has two things. It has each book has a file with all unused dialogue or ideas or things or character work, and they're about 50 to 60 pages per book, some of them longer.
Mhm.
And then I have the new idea folder. So in the new idea folder, I've got, excuse me, I'll cook up ideas and blah blah blah, and as I'm working on them, I'll put them in there and start. And then sometimes the brain will keep picking at them, so I'll open the file and
Mhm.
dump in the new ideas. And but it's normally a couple years of development with me before I reach out to an artist.
Yeah.
And then I feel like once I've kind of got it, like something worth pitching, that's a full formed thing. If an artist is like, oh my god, that's great, let's do that, then we start to develop the rest, with get the visuals together.
Uh, when you're at the point of figuring out, how to find a collaborator for some of these books, what are are there specific things in mind? Are there names in mind that for each of the projects that you would like to go after, or is it? Because you've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of your friends. You've also, over the course of your career, broken in new talent. So, can you talk me through a little bit about kind of the matchmaking process for you, and if that's changed at all since
Well, it used to
since you
be, it was before anybody cared or gave a shit, and I was, writing and drawing and storyboarding and animating and just paying the bills and living in a rotting garage next to a highway. Those years were just whoever would be interested in discussing doing something, and then me
Mhm.
just trying to fight it forward. And so, some of those earlier situations were kind of necessity more than ideal. And
Sure.
then as I had a couple of things that, were good at, and people, responded to them. And so I have a file, like this file, like Matteo Scalera wasn't really doing anything. And
Sure.
I'd seen his work online. Um, and convinced Marvel to let me bring him in on my Avengers, uh, um, Secret Avengers.
Secret Avengers.
Secret Avengers. They were secret. They weren't out in the open about it.
So cool.
So it's a lot of trial and error. Like I'm
Sure.
developing an animated series right now, and it's the same thing with concept artists and trying to find people for that. Is a lot of time online digging and looking at various places to find people. And
So where online would you say you go? Because I feel like
oh, you want me to
in
give it all? You want me to just tell?
well, no, not necessarily. You don't give it all away, but I mean, look, like even as you're right, like as a fan, um, in the late 2000s ish, or in the early 2010s or whatever, right? Like that was the era of like the online blog, and it was the early Twitter days, and it felt the creative community in a sense felt a little bit more centralized than maybe it does now, in the
Sure.
sense that like art now is everywhere, but where do you even begin to look for someone who you think
I think that I have the
fits?
benefit of being an artist and a storyboard
Sure.
artist and an art director and sort of knowing what I'm looking for and can see a spark in someone's work.
Right.
And that's allowed me to do a pretty good job of casting, looking for artists. But in terms of the decentralized sort of industry of it all, I mean, I think before Twitter and Twitter doesn't come alive until 2009, 10,
Right.
11. I think that before that it was conventions and meeting
Yep.
people who liked books. I think I met Robert Kirkman and Tony Moore because Kieran Dwyer and I were doing independent books as well, and we were sat next to each other at cons, and we all became pals. And then Tony and I started talking. Jerome Pena was a student at the Academy of Art University when I was teaching there,
Right.
and his sketchbooks were being passed around, and so I reached out to him. And then, so all of those early days, and Kieran Dwyer and I became pals and worked on a number of projects together. Um, and that was like, I'm trying to think of how that was really. It was harder back in those days finding new people. It was so people I met at shows, and then people who would introduce me to people I met at shows, and you would see people's portfolio or whatever. But yeah, around 2000, 8, 9, 10, 7, the blogs took off and everybody started doing their own sites. And you could, hunt from one artist to another and fall down a rabbit hole where you were looking at art all night. And I would make file folders of people whose art spoke to me or was interesting. And then, so now there's like 8 or 9 websites I go to. There's a number of people's feeds with all the social media feeds, especially Instagram and all these various places that people post their artwork. It's pretty easy to chase from one to another, and then every 20 or 30 artists I see, I'll be like, oh, that'd be very interesting for this idea, and eventually I'll reach out. I think a lot of what I'm in right now, like with Brett Parson on grommets.
Yep.
I saw his work on Tank Girl, and I also saw some of his stuff that he was posting online, and I was like, well, perfect. There's nobody more perfect for grommets. And Roland Boschi, who did Holy Roller, we've been working together forever. One of the most underrated comic artists in the world. At like Eduardo Rizzo and Frank Miller, like just that level good. And so great. I will always work with Roland because he's so great. And then before that, Ben Gall and I doing Napalm Lullaby, we had done Death or Glory and enjoyed working together. He did, a story in The Scumbag. So a lot of it is like, I think Death or Glory, I think I found Ben Gall through an art director friend of mine at Electronic Arts when I was working there on Dead Space, and showed me one of his books, and I eventually reached out. So a lot of it comes from just always kind of being on the hunt for art
Sure.
and trying to find
Is there
people that fit
is
the
is
tone.
there a bit of if you end up working with someone who, or an artist who hasn't necessarily worked in comics before, is there a bit of translation that you have to kind of do at that part, or does it really just kind of come out as you begin the collaboration process, and it just kind of clicks.
I don't think I've ever worked with anybody who hadn't worked in comics or
Okay,
loved comics or understood comics or
sure.
done pages, you know. So Jerome had been doing some comic books, had done, you know, a couple of issues of something before I tapped him to do a fill-in on Strange Girl, and I
Hmm.
was like, oh my God, he's so good, and we ended up doing Fear Agent together, and then.
Right.
I'm just trying to think. I don't think there has been anybody who's been from another industry that I've had to sort of train in. Most
Right.
everybody is comic literate.
Hmm. Uh, for your own sake, has your process, whether it's script writing, um, how you approach just even scenes and pages, because obviously, you being an artist yourself, I feel like there's a bit of an edge there in a sense, but uh, what would you say are maybe some of the tricks or short, I hesitate to call them shortcuts, but just like things that you've learned maybe now in the later part of your career that you wish you had maybe earlier
Oh
on.
man. Well, there was an arrogance, I think, about story and structure and dialogue, and a lack of understanding about brevity and the lack of understanding of structure and studying structure, and almost this sort of geez, I mean, it's endless. I think that it really didn't start to click for me until I wrote a feature film in 2000. I wrote two feature films in 2008 and another in 2010, where I was paid to write movies,
Mm-hmm.
and then had to rewrite them, and then had to come to LA and sit at a table and argue, and then had to like really kind of rework it and rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it. And every time I rewrote it, I was like, oh, this could work better here. This doesn't need to be this many words. It can be the guy walks in the room. It's stupid things like show, don't tell, where you're
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, 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 I get it. But you're still telling, you know, you'll still do it. Much harder to figure out how you're going to illustrate that character moment through choice and through you know, purely visual terms. And so there was a sort of a pridefulness early in my career that was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, well, I don't need that. I'm very just naturally good at this. And you're like, yeah, you're not. You need to learn. You need to learn that stuff. And working in film and television, I think, you know, was huge. It was the
Mm-hmm.
rewriting, the doing your front work, and you know, I had a number of editors, to their credit at Marvel. Well, you know, I guess that's 2008 and 9 that started, who were very sort of in the same ballpark of scrutinizing and heavily like, you know, editing and making sure that you were rewriting and rewriting and rewriting and rethinking. And every rewrite got tighter and better and cleaner. And then you figured out smarter solutions and visual solutions and cut the dialogue and throw away the exposition and take this many words and shrink it down to that many words. And then if it can say the same thing, then the reader is going to keep their eye moving instead of these, you know, the rookie balloon, you know, with 5 sentences in it. You're like, ugh, it's not. What am I? This isn't a comic book. It's a really poorly written novel at this point. Yeah, there's so many, but I think that, and all of that really kicked into gear, doing the showrun job and running the room on Deadly Class and having to oversee the pilot on that while I was writing the pilot for Black Science and working with Cary Fukunaga on Tokyo Ghost. And then also just that really, the pressure cooker on that, and having to sit across from the Russo brothers and argue story and then get on the phone with Cary Fukunaga, and I was developing with Seth Rogen. And I was at a level where you couldn't just wing it. You had to know your shit, the terminology, you had to be fast. You had to be able to punch this stuff up quick, and you had to have also the work ethic to be able to sit in front of a script. And John Cleese talks about living with the fires, and that the
Mm-hmm.
best things are because a good writer will live with it on fire until the right idea comes. So like right now, this thing I'm writing for Daniel Acuna, he's been waiting on script for a couple of weeks, and I fed him a little and I gave him a cover because I'm just like, it's on fire, and I'm deep in the story now, and he's done this. I mean, when people see what Acuna's done on this thing, it's like, oh, I have to show up, and I have to show up A plus level. And so, but that also means living with the fire. I don't have this idea quite yet for the scene. I want to establish a scene that shows three characters, tells you everything I want to tell you about them, but I don't want them to talk. I don't want them to do something overt. I don't want captions. I want to show it. And Acuna's the kind of guy that can actually do that. And so I'm just living with it on fire, and it sucks because it's not done. God damn it, it's not done. And I just a hack in an earlier version of myself.
Yeah.
You didn't quite get that. You got like, oh, that's good enough. That solves it. Oh, I'll just put it in the captions. Like Fear Agent gets better as it goes. But early in Fear Agent, I was suffering. I was committing a lot of sins. My name is Heath Houston, and here's how I think about things. And they're like, yeah, okay. But is there a way I could see that and not have you tell me? And all those very simple sort of basic foundation rules eventually, when you get to that point, it's what I say to Jerome Opeña, where I'm like, dude, Seven to Eternity took him like 100 years. And every single panel, I was like, look at Alex Toth. Just do this, do a shadowy background and a character. I'm going to put a balloon over there. It's a texty, they're talking. He can't. And I realized it's like with any of these things, whatever they're worth, whatever this craft is worth, it doesn't matter because we put our lives into it. And when you elevate it to a certain level, and when you get that good, doing it down here, it doesn't feel great. When you know that if like this thing with Acuna waiting on the script, which right now is what I was working on just before this call, just like, you know that there's a better idea. You know that it's there. And I'll always get there if I live with the fires. And Jerome and these artists are the same way. They're not going to shortcut panels just to hit the print date. And that can really affect single issue sales. And we always try, lately we've gotten a little more like, hey, let's bring in James Herron to help you. Or let's bring in on Sacrificers. Let's get Andre Lima Araujo to come in and plug in for an arc to give Max a time to take a breath and come back. And as long as the art is like at that same level, the integrity stays kind of plugged in. But you can't ask somebody when they push the craft to this, it's really hard to say, now put it back down to here. And so it's a lot the same in that it's like a mixed curse blessing, but I find that I put far more time into the front loading now than I used to with outlines and character worksheets and just years of kind of getting my head around it. And that enables me to, in the books, just kind of lighten the load. I know what's underneath there's a term, the iceberg, you can only see 10% of it. The rest is underwater. You know it's there. And that's another good, classic writer trick. And having done that, now the new books, I can just go like, I know this character's background. I don't need to have captions where he says, Dad left when I was 7, walked up with a pack of smokes and never came back. I don't need to do that. I know it. If it comes up in conversation or as I'm telling the story, there's a point for him to say, like, yeah, just like my old man, and then move on. Subtle. Subtlety's kind of tough in comics. It works better in screenplays. It works better when hearing an actor speak it and moving on. But I think that the training from one definitely, affects the other. And it's just the version of me 25 years ago when I first started writing and drawing my own comics. If I knew how much work it was going to take to get really good, I might not have done it, because you have to keep telling yourself like, I'm good enough to do this, but you're not. You're not.
So then does knowing what you know now, does that make comics and making comics even more magical or scarier?
Well, it makes it harder because again, it's like old versions of myself. Acuna would have had that script. It would have been solved by like, fuck it, they do this and this. That gets me through it. But I know there's a visual way to do it. I know there's a way where I see the character do this. I know there's a grid. I know there's a thing, and I've almost got it. But it's an important introduction to a character. But the point being, it makes it harder. I don't know if it like the first time I really tried to use this new way of thinking of it was A Righteous Thirst for Vengeance.
Okay.
where I felt like if I used to think of comics that had to have number. It was like it was a little prose, and I can get across philosophy and ideology in a way. There's a depth to it, and that can be successful. I think Low and Black Science and Deadly Class and Tokyo Ghost and Death or Glory and that era of my books really are steeped in that. And then I was sort of then I spent 3-4 years working really heavily in film and television and came out the other end thinking, well, let's try it a little bit less. And Righteousness for Vengeance was a big swing at not it hopefully making it a little bit more magical because I did the front work here. I didn't have to tell you everything. You almost never get to know much about the lead character, the protagonist, Sonny. You almost never know anything about him in the goes for 10-12 issues. You don't really have to, though. I do, and maybe it comes across and maybe it doesn't. I find that makes the process. When I finally just took a breath and said, I believe in the story. I know the story. I know the character. I'm just going to let the story be told, and I'm not going to worry so much about making sure that every little idea or every single aspect of these things I thought up are constantly being expressed, and that makes it more joyful. The Seasons, which is coming out in January, is very much sort of born of that writing style where Paul and I spent, I had the ideas, I had the basic world, I had some of the things, and we started really doing phone calls during the pandemic when I was hiding in Hawaii for a year. Rough. It was rough. It was rough. I know. We're all crazy. It was a terrible
Look, if there's one way to spend the before times, that's a way to do
it. I bailed, but I had good reasons. I have families with my wife has autoimmune, and we were hiding. But so that's how far back we started developing this. Around the same time I was writing A Righteous Thirst for Vengeance. So the kind of tonality and the execution are very similar in that, like, I know the story, I know the commentary, I know the world, I know the characters, and I wrote the first issue and I tried to add captions and do the kind of narration thing where the character's talking to you and you're getting a little of this, and I like that in some books, but again, now that I'm able to kind of just take my time with the front load, I find that leads to more magic, in the creation process where I can go, just let Paul and Mateus shine and just tell this story, and people will eventually realize that what they were looking at was the setup for these next bigger things that come.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a lot about the process of making the books, but I would love to hear a bit more about the pitches, right? So obviously you've got you've got a great deal. You've made Image Comics your home, but I'd love to hear, like I said, just what makes a good and solid pitch in your opinion, and what have you learned in the pitch process, in whether getting books approved or not approved or sent back to work or whatever, that gets you to the green light?
Well, I've been writing. I had a pretty good track record where I had to study pitching and get good enough at it that I sold 4 or 5 TV shows and a couple of movies, and I'm currently working on anyway. The amount of attention and focus that goes into that, I think, it's like lifting a weight. Eventually you grow muscle, and the more I did it and have done it, I think I started writing like serious pitches in 2002, back when I had I would write a film pitch, but I don't think my pitches got very good for about 7 years of just doing them. And that's the hard thing about writing, is like you have an infinite well of opportunity and options, and you have to fall down that well and choose them and start trying to piece together instinctually what works, and thinking about how you're telling a story and how much you need to tell somebody in a pitch. But you'll fuck up a bunch. And so every time you fuck up, you go, oh, that's hot. You don't touch it again. Or you realize that it's only touchable at this stage. And So I think that I have a list of 3 things that I know, and if I have these things, then I can pitch anything. I need something personal, and not as the cliched sort of like, I really want to talk about how, like the northern herons, or like, their marshlands being destroyed. Not in a sort of virtue broadcast
Sure.
performance way, but like really truly care. The new thing I'm working on with Greg Tocchini, we haven't announced yet, but it's really steeped in my obsession with climate change and my fear, and having been obsessed with it for like 30 years now, or 25 years, and watching everything I read come true. Like, I care and I have something to say. So it's got to have something personal that I'm really, really dying to talk about. It's got to have something that I want to say about the world. It's got to have an external component. Tokyo Ghost, as I realized in 2012 when I was developing that I had 3 monitors, an iPad, a thing, my kid's in the corner with an iPad, and I was like, where is this headed? So it was about tech addiction, and
Sure.
I was experiencing that. It was changing my life rapidly. I was the beginning of like, I'm sorry, or at dinner, but I'm on my phone. I'm like, that seems like kind of a bullshit move, doesn't it? I'm sorry. Now it's like normal. I'm like, I'm sorry, I was talking like, whoa. And so you find that thing you want to say about the world. You find the thing you want to say personally. The thing that if it has. I guess the climate change one is more world, and then personal is how you are reacting to that. Or in the case of Tokyo Ghost, it's a story about tech addiction, but the personal aspect is, what about a codependent in that relationship? There's a lot of addiction in my family, and a lot of things that I grew up with, that so a couple of codependents in there, and I wanted to write about that. So, and then the third is visual. You got to have a big visual component and something exciting. And if you can get those 3, then you can write your pitch, and it starts off with your personal. And normally, if I can't figure out like a really hot sizzle, like a really great sort of opening to the thing that'll grab you, then I'll abandon the story anyway. And
Okay.
there's been 2 things that I've actually done where I didn't have an opening that got me, or I changed it too much, and I don't like those books very much. So I got to know, like, if the beginning is just like, oh, I got that. Like the Scumbag, that beginning lived with me. In 2016, I was like, this Lemmy-like sort of dirtbag heroin addict who's like, just like a leftover from the late 70s who just never wanted the party to end, just never gave up. He ends up going to score some heroin, and then he's in an alleyway trying to shoot it, and he loses the needle while 2 super spies are fighting over the infinity maxima formula, or some cockamamie superhero bullshit. And then the needles get mixed up, and he shoots that up, and now you've got the power of a superhero in the worst person on earth. But the power only activates when he does noble things. That little wrinkle adds a lot to that story, because we've seen the piece of trash with superhero powers. Like, yeah, but now the only way he has powers is to actually be thinking of noble purpose. That little wrinkle gives it a human touch. And when I had that, I knew like I was going to do that book no matter what. Like it tickled me. The title tickled me. So you'll get the opening. It has a lot to do with it as well. So those things kind of congeal into a place. And titles usually either are born at the beginning or even sometimes the end. 7 to Eternity used to be called Springs of Zoll, and I think it was Kirkman and Stevenson just called me. They're like, "This title's terrible." And I was like, "Yeah, all right, I can do better than Springs of Zoll." I just wanted it to be very, welcome to the Springs of Zoll. Very kind of like bad. I have a thing for things that used to be bad, but people sometimes don't know that you're doing homage, like 80s fantasy novels. Like Springs of Zoll really was sort of reminiscent. It evoked a feeling of that to me, and they were like, "I don't think anybody's going to get that. You should think of a different title." As those things congeal, and you get that list, then writing the pitch and I spend about, when I pitch a TV show, I spend about 3-4 months writing the pitch over and over and over, and then memorizing it, and then getting it down. And once I have that and story and character, a long-winded explanation for somebody who was talking about brevity.
No, no, but I think, but I love that about. But I do want to talk about Scumbag. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about your time in TV and movie land, in a sense, because I feel like it was one of those things where you were humming along doing the you were doing the comic stuff, and obviously you were hoping to get one of these things up and running, and then like it feel like a lot of things kind of happened all at once for you, in a sense where there was interest in a lot of your different projects. Obviously, you got Deadly Class kind of up and running, and then you got very much involved in that. Has that been all that it's cracked up to be? Is it what has that been like for you in trying to balance all of it and continue to learn and continue to be creative and have a life and
Well,
and a
yeah,
family
you
and
can't,
all
you
that.
give up something along the way.
Sure.
So I started my career as an animator, and
Right.
being an animator made me realize I needed to have a creative outlet where I wasn't just a cog in a machine, but I did something that was mine. And I eventually quit my job with Bluth, making features to make my own comic books. I realized that the economics of comic books, especially in 1998, they weren't going to support me and my collaborators. And we tried for about a year, and that led into Blackheart Billy, which led into numbers. But I moved to San Francisco. I moved to LA for a while, worked on the Iron Giant. So then I would jump between like animate for a while and then do a comic. Moved to San Francisco where I taught animation, or I worked on commercials at Wild Brain, do a thing. But I always was sort of trying to make my own cartoons. And so I started an animation studio funded by Wild Brain, and that was during the big .com growth of 99, 2000, and then it popped. The cartoon never got aired, so nobody ever saw it after a year and a half of work. But I realized, like, all right, that's rough. Comic books, however, I don't know how many people will see it, but it will be seen. I meet you, I go, here's a comic book I made. And so I started inking the Avengers over Kieran and doing finishes on that stuff to pay the bills. And then I started back up doing comic books, and that was when I was developing Nightmare and Strange Girl and Fear Agent and Sea of Red. And there was more. End League, Gigantic. It was Last Days of American Crime. There was a whole
Is there a
slew.
Remender Presidential Library wing in your compound, or?
I didn't. Henry Rollins once said I don't have my own books up in the house because it's narcissistic, and I didn't do it forever. But we just bought a house, and it's the first time I've had my own house and library, and I did put up my stuff, and it was like, fuck it, I don't care. Like, I have a huge library. Yes, there's a couple of things of my own work. That's okay.
Sorry, go ahead, continue.
So I totally forgot what
You were talking about you had done the animation stuff with then the .com bubble burst, and we're
what was the umbrella before I got in the weeds and just started running around?
It was what was getting into the film and TV side of things.
Oh, the film and TV. So I started there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Long way of saying I started there. Went to comics
Sure.
because of I can make what I want with a purity of an intention. And I'm sort of a DIY punk kid who likes to be able to control and do what I want. And I don't want to have to get permission or arm wrestle with 20 people. If I can line up with an artist and we can get our heads kind of straight, we can make it. And that's not really feasible in film or television or animation. And so it was interesting having left. My studio collapsed and went bankrupt. And so I went off and just made comics for a while, where I was back down, from like I run an animation studio to like no one gives a fuck about you and you inked the Avengers, you dumb dummy. So now you're an inker. And I'm like, wait, I just did that job once to pay the bills because I can do it. They're like, no, you're an inker. I went to an editor at DC. I love telling this story. Who was like, I was like, all right, I got this great idea. It's before The Walking Dead, and I was doing this thing called Doll and Creature, and I was in love with all these different iterations of zombies. And I was like, it's a Batman story. It's a story of the Joker, the zombies, and he just goes, and the editor just goes, he turns to Kieran, who was drawing the Avengers at the time. He goes, "Is this your inker pitching me a story?" And I love that era because it was like, oh shit, I just woke up and be like, oh, I just completely branded myself. And these people love to just put you in a box and they go, you're this. And I'm like, the fuck is that about? So that glass ceiling had to be rebroke. But I just started, the comic books. I had an opportunity to become like the lead storyboard guy at Electronic Arts on The Simpsons. They were going to make a bunch of Simpsons games. And, obviously huge fan of The Simpsons. And I had to choose between that comfortable job and 401k and health bennies and all the good stuff, or moving to Portland and living in a hovel to keep doing comics. And I was like, comics! So interestingly, eventually that didn't, it's a tough gig. And then babies started coming out of my wife, and I was like, babies? And so I had to make money, so I went to Marvel. Long story short, the thing that led to the film and television was really quitting all of the Marvel stuff, getting back into what initially kind of excited me about this and doing my own stuff. And in terms of is it all that, like I'm still show running a thing right now that's in development at Sony Netflix. I've been working on it for 4 years. It's been it's the best pilot I've ever written. Everyone loves it. It's great. I have a metric ton of some of the best concept work in the world that's been done for this thing. It could just very easily get passed on, as most of them do. That can be rough, especially given that I have the outlet where it's like, on the other hand, I've got new pages in from Steve Epting on our thing. And I'm like, that'll happen. And that's exciting. And we have this tiny little community. And if anybody's still listening to this podcast 17 hours in,
this is good stuff. This is good stuff.
It is a beautiful thing. This tiny little, tiny community. So small, but has its own stores, has its own culture, emanates more creative energy that infiltrates and colors culture than anything other than music. And it originates and has the power to do anything because those walls don't exist. And so it's tough having that and having earned that, with my life's blood, and have that opportunity and keep doing the film and television, which, I've written 5 movies, none got made. But, one of my books did get turned into a movie, and it was a terrible pile of shit that I had nothing to do with. Then you get something like Deadly Class, which is a dream. Working with all these wonderful people and, getting to work with the Russos and kind of build this thing up and loving it. But it never had much of a chance. It's a $50 million show in sci-fi, and they're hoping that that's going to light the world on fire. And you're like, ugh. Thank you for your faith, but we did our best, and I love the show. But that was an actual dream come true. That was like, I'm on set some days, like, oh, nobody knows this all happened to me. We're filming my childhood, like that's a dream come true, and what a privilege, right? Sure. But I had an overall deal with Sony for 4 years of development, writing pilots, writing pitches, and I sold everything I went out with. Except one thing. And the process is wonderful. It makes you a better writer. It makes you calloused, so you stop being so precious. Comics makes people precious, where you're not going to tell me. Well, in film and television, you're just going to get beaten up all the time, and you have to be able to vet and hold on to what matters and protect it if you can. But if you can't, and somebody makes a good point, you have to have the wherewithal to see time to give that up. Time to go, yeah, it's not that precious. I've been shown that it's wrong. And I find that entirely comic people kind of have a tough time with that. And film and television and animation, it forces you to take part in the communal conversation while still trying to protect what you really truly believe in. Best idea matters and all that. So I learned a ton. I think I became like 20 times better at what I do. Um, but I think like the show I'm working on right now, I wrote the pitch in 2020 and then took it out and did all of the meetings and everything and sold it in 2021 and have, been developing it since. And it's a beautiful experience to, get deeper into one of your books. And to writing the pilot means revisiting this thing and making it better and really rethinking the characters. And it gets better every time, right? It's getting better and better and better. But the difficult thing, and Patton Oswalt said something once that stuck with me when we were talking about screenwriting, and he was like, "Yeah, it's years and years or months and months of typing and typing and working and working and getting this thing perfect, and you care and it's perfect, and then you print it out and you're holding it, and you're like, there it is, and you roll it up and you put it in a cannon and you shoot it to the top of your bookshelf." And it can feel like that because so few things can get made that I do wonder after this current development how much more I have in me because I am lucky enough to have the comics. And I've learned a ton, but it might be okay after this. I have no more plans to go pitching anything for a little while. I've worked really hard on some development that blew up because of crazy people. It's gotten to the point where I'm like, God is the universe, whatever is out there is going to tell me if this current show I'm working on is greenlit, great. I'm gonna get back into that mode where I can work day and night and have a hammock that I sit on and spit words into a bucket. Um, uh, but if it doesn't, I'm very, very lucky, and I hate the term blessed because what the fuck? There's a wizard come by and goes, "You are anointed with blessings."
Hashtag blessed.
Hashtag
How different?
disingenuous, the word blessed. I've never heard anybody say it and be like, yeah, man, yeah, really feeling that. And it's like, I wouldn't say blessed.
How
I have real gratitude for the comic books,
right?
and to be able to like take all the video editing stuff I've learned how to do and make little videos to promote the books. It's very like back down to like comic, like grassroots where I came from, the original goalpost. It's very, very comfortable home.
I love that. How different do you think the process would be? Well, I mean, I guess you've worked on stuff that is not, all yours, but I have to imagine there's a big difference in the stuff that you're working on now. This is your stuff, right? This is not stuff that you are working on behalf of someone or whatever, but you're taking the stuff that you started in comics to that next level. Would it be much different had that if that wasn't necessarily the case?
Yeah, I tried. Uh, I developed I don't even know if I can talk about it. I don't know if it matters. Who cares? I developed a Spider-Man's with Lord and Miller when I was at Sony. And I didn't really want to do it, and that's maybe why it didn't work out. I tried really hard, and but it fell apart at the end and didn't end up happening. And during it, I felt like I had compromised everything. I was like, oh, am I going to come fix another one of these fucking corporations' characters so I can watch them make $1 billion but never treat me like a human being? Like, how many of those did I do? Like, quite a few. And it doesn't feel great to go back. But so I also realized with the amount of work, and right after that, I was offered a huge showrun job, but it was a bake-off with another showrunner for a property that I grew up with in the 80s that I really liked that was going to television. And I had just come off of the Spider-Mans and realized, oh, I'm never, ever, that job, having done it on Deadly Class and having done it in animation, at my studio back in the day, I know enough to know that it's going to swallow my whole life. And I just don't think my whole life was put here for whatever reason, for the 10 people who give a shit or my kids, whoever it is that it might matter to, like, because, it's not for, I've done my time building my audience by going, did I make you like Deadpool and see him as a human? it helped my career doing that. But it also was like I watch movies now where I go, that's all my stuff. Like weird. Like, do I get paid? You're like, and I don't want to get into like grievance and I took
Sure.
that job and went chasing it. But
Right.
the point being, I'm better playing CBGBs and doing original songs to
Mhm.
100 people than I am doing Aerosmith cover songs in the Palladium to a million adoring fans. I fit better in the other one.
Well, the perfect segue to go back to uh, Scumbag, because for me, and I'd love to get your perspective. Like that book felt like such a surprise in that as like I I saw the premise for it, in the solicit and things like that, but I think like it was one of those, once you actually experienced that first issue, I think you really got to understand like, oh, okay, here's what we're doing, and it at the time kind of felt like almost a distilled version of Rick Remender in a sense, where like it felt like there was a little bit of everything of what you had done kind of in this book. Is that just my reading on that? Is that my own personal?
It's that's why I loved it so much. And Ernie got me through the pandemic, and he got me through 2020. Writing Ernie was just a joy,
Uh-huh.
and I have started writing more. I don't know if I'll ever get to it, but um, I like the idea of Ernie Ray Clementine as the centerpiece to a big giant generator crossover. I keep typing, and I can't stop typing stories. Um, yeah, I missed the sort of levity, the
Mm-hmm.
Gen X sort of sense of humor that had. Oh yeah, that's all terrible and awful. So we could all sit around and be like, clutching our pearls and shitting our pants, or we could try to make fun of it and laugh and be like, aha. But that means you have to have an intellectual ability to see that like the person's not saying it's not horrible. Like so
Right.
I wanted to with Ernie to take a snapshot and take a look at some of the things that were going on in the world and through this guy who's just, he's a burned out 1970s Iron Maiden stoner guy who was working on his Camaro in the front yard, doing lines, and never wanted to give up. Never wanted the party to end. But then the world changed, and the party changed, and who could party? And Ernie's just like, man, he just doesn't understand anything. He's Matthew McConaughey's character from Dazed and Confused, but he got old, and he's still trying to have that party, man. And I just fell in love with it, and it got me through. So, and it was. I mean, it takes superhero stuff and spy stuff, and it also takes the sort of absurdist comedy things that I love
Mm-hmm.
writing, and that's one of the things that I think that I've learned is you got to let your freak flag fly to bring in similar freaks. And
Mm-hmm.
Andy Samberg reading the Scumbag is why we worked together on Holy Roller. Is
Mm-hmm.
Andy loved it, and I love what Andy does, and that was a huge I think Andy and Lonely Island have. You look at what they've done culturally with those shorts
Yep.
that started YouTube basically, and Andy is just such a goddamn national treasure. That doesn't happen if I don't write the Scumbag and do it my way and really lean into whatever I want. And I remember at the time everyone's like, "This, what's going on?" This comic's going to be really. Everyone's so terrified of the offense machine. Like the tension, like ah. And I'm like, guys, this is not like he's not he's slightly misogynistic cokehead. He's not like a monster. He's not like they're like And I had a friend who's like, "Why are you writing a comic about a racist?" I'm like, "A what?" I go, "Ernie's not a racist. He loves everybody, man. He doesn't give a fuck. Love is love, and he doesn't. He just wants to do bumps and listen to fucking Motley Crue. Like, what is? He's playing Motorhead in his Trans Am. He doesn't give a fuck. Like, he wants Judas Priest all day long and cheap trucker meth." And I just realized everything had gotten so rigid and goddamn stressful. And so Ernie was a joyous way to just write this guy is just like walking
Nice.
through it all, being like, "Man, you all lost your fucking minds." And it got me through, and it was nice because the sales were great and people loved it. And so it was
Yeah.
nice to know. You always know when you take that weird swing that makes everybody nervous, like you shouldn't do it. So
Right.
many people, you shouldn't do this book. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
the fuck? Why?
Well, like, so, okay, so on the flip side, then you put out a book like Grommets, right, where is a book that over time, I think, like began to find its audience, and it feels like a very different kind of Rick Remender book in that instance, but is also it's so slice of lifey in a sense, and I think hits to a lot of a lot of the readers that it found, like their core in a sense, and that, I think that's what helped build its word of mouth and things like that. And so, can you talk just a little bit about the development of that and going through, because I know you've mentioned that this book is a very personal book for you and Brian, but it feels like a totally different experience than.
Well, it's definitely different. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I started writing grommets while I was deep in the scumbag. So it's 2020. It's pandemic. It's another pandemic book. Everything, this entire wave of Giant Generator books is all pandemic books. The Holy Roller is right after the pandemic. Grommets started during the pandemic. Napalm Lullaby predates the pandemic. And Sacrificers predates the pandemic. So that it's weird because you're still living with like the DNA and the foundation of things from 2017 to 2020.
Sure.
But here you are in 2024, almost 2025, and it creates interesting things because that foundation with the frosting of now can make really weird and things you wouldn't come up with in a committee can be formed through that. I think Grommets was mid pandemic. I was going really crazy, unlike everybody else. And before I had fled the mainland to go live in Hawaii, Brian Posehn and I were doing. I was doing Zooms with anybody I knew, and I was like, "Hi." Ah. And so we started talking about doing a comic book, and we developed Grommets at first with Sony to be this sort of hijinks thing about three modern skaters doing a modern Animal Chin to go find a version of Tony Hawk who had become, a sort of, hedonistic drug addict. And it didn't work because it wasn't real, right? It's like
Right.
a bunch of guys in their, 40s and 50s writing about modern skateboard kids. It just felt meh. It felt like a mediocre 2002 comedy somehow. And we developed it and really cared about it. We couldn't find a way through it, so we put it on ice for a while. And one day I realized, like, oh, well, I could tell you why that doesn't work. Like, it's not about us, and it's not our era. And dudes our age. I remember reading a Spider-Man comic when Rocket Racer showed up, and it was 1985. And I was like a full skate punk. It was my life at that point. And I was like into comics really deeply as well. Those were the two things that,
Sure.
that fed my soul. And it was like, I don't know, Howard Mackey. No burn on Howard Mackey, but it's like this. And in the photos, it's like he's got a cigar and he's like, "Hey kids, New York," but he's riding a skateboarder, and it's like he's riding a 1970s banana board with rockets, and he's like, hang 10, jive turkey, I don't even remember, but I remember it was fucking bad, and it was like this guy doesn't know what the fuck he's like anything about youth culture at all. And I realized that in even doing a sardonic kind of comedy about modern skaters, there's no version of it where I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to be like, "Hey kids, we like the Minor Threats back in the day and the Dead Kennedys, man." See, and so we started talking, and I just called Brian one day, and I said when I was in Hawaii, I said, "Look, let's get on Zoom. Let's just start telling each other stories about shit we went through." And my assistant will collect them and put them in a file. And we did about 2 or 3 of those Zooms. And then when I got back into town, he came into the Giant Generator offices, and we had lunch and did another one. And then I just took all that and went off and wrote the book. And so it's about 80% true stories with little, fibs and stitches and things like that. Like, there's, I won't say what is what, but that's sort of the how that was born. And then I have a artist folder where Brett Brett Parsons is in there, and I was looking at his stuff, and I'm like, Brett would be pretty goddamn amazing for this if he's interested. And also just to let myself do a sort of optic nerve, like there's big, dangerous and salacious seeming things in there because it's got that DNA of deadly class. But grommets is really at the same time, those are things that happened. It wasn't like it wasn't like, there's no big violence in there that was made up. That stuff was all real. And so and so much worse. But you try to balance that with the really small moments that, especially in modern comic books, we can all get so caught up in, this is what the audiences need now. The Marvel movies have trained them to think like this, and character doesn't matter. They need this. You got to keep their attention. And grommets is an exercise in, well, fuck all that. Just, there's a Bell and Sebastian song where he says, nobody writes them like they used to, so it may as well be me. And I had that written down on my desk on a sticky pad forever. Is, well, nobody writes them like they used to, so I may as well do it the way I think that it used to be done that mattered. And grommets was a swing at kind of, sinking into that kind of slice of life in an era that I feel I'm.
How do you feel about the response to it, though? Right. So like how do you feel about the response? Because I feel like a bunch of folks have really come out to say, like, yes, this feels like the life I lived.
Yeah. And it's, look, I mean, this is, you get me rambling about this podcast will go 7 more years. The generational realities of being a Gen X kid, if you were raised between 1967 and even like, the old traditional Gen X begins in 62, 63, and then some millennial sociologists changed it. Like, wait, excuse me? But that's how we got a taste of what our life would be. Literally a couple of years after National Geographic did a Generation X documentary. And it's like, Generation X, if you were born between 1962 and 1980, you were a Gen X. And then somebody in the next generation was like, no, they should be 1965, so I can call more people boomers. Like, more thing. We hate the fucking boomers. Where did you kids come from? Fuck you. Get off my lawn, bark at clouds, etc., etc., etc.
That's it. You've become that guy. Congratulations.
I've always been that guy. Even as a kid, I was that guy. Sitting around snottily telling everybody, like, your music sucks. That was part of the elitism of the generation. But I think that the tonality and the specificity of it is not captured in most pop culture that tries. Even the movies about us were made by baby boomers. Like The Breakfast Club gets kind of there. It's like archetypes but nobody no Gen Xer was making those movies.
Sure. And
so the specificity in what it was actually like to be a kid at the beginning of skateboarding, like in the early 80s, and we took, Brian's a little older than me, so we took his 1980 and my 1985 and landed on, like, I think we went from 84 to 85 to 86 or something. But I think that and I could be off on my numbers, but I read once that there's 82 million millennials in the United States, and there's like 40 million or 39 million Gen Xers, and there's like 85 million Gen Z. And then, so you've got, and then there's the boomers on the other side where it's like 81 or 80. So anyway, we're just nobody knows. Hi, guys. And they're like, ignore that. You'll see news articles. It's like Gen Z, millennials. And that'll be like baby boomers. And they'll give graphs. And I'm like, guys, there's a whole other generation in there. And I think we're pretty swell, huh? Come on over. We invented a lot of shit you guys are pretty stoked on that you don't give us a lot of credit for, sees? But there was so much stuff in there that the archaeological dig mattered. And it mattered to Brett, which is why the book works. Because Brett and Moreno, man, they were just trading research, and we were all digging stuff up, and they went in. And it doesn't read like what I was saying about like the Howard Mackey Spider-Man Rocket Racer, where it's like, man, kids, he's got a skateboard. He's on fire with attitude. It's not, it's so poochy, right? Mm-hmm. But this was just an attempt to go like, hey, 83, 84, 85 looked a little bit like this for us. But you can't get that without somebody like Brett, who look, it's the series is going to be 7 issues when it's said and done.
Yep.
Brett's been drawing it for 2.5 years, and I mean full time. You know, you don't get a thing to be that good because it got shit out. It's
Right.
somebody who has been locked in his house for 2.5 years doing it. So it's very fulfilling. I didn't expect it. Same as Deadly Class, the sort of snapshot of 1987's underground and taking all of the cliques and groups and turning them into like assassins and blah blah blah. I didn't like I thought Deadly Class was just it was the for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody loved Fear Agent and everybody loved X Force and they wanted me to do more of this kind of crime or this kind of science fiction and this kind of like big idea stuff. And Deadly Class was the for me book, but Deadly Class found a gravity center from the authentic sort of human stuff that's in there, I think. And Gromit seems to have done the same thing.
Love that. All right, we're gonna land this plane. I want to talk just two more things. Or I want to talk. I do want to talk about the Sacrificers, and then we'll get to the seasons. The Sacrificers feels like, kind of the next, or I mean the next, but the current big Rick Remender journey, in a sense. Is this a book that you've got planned out for a bit, or is it and if so, is it initially what that plan was for this book? Or because again, right, like this is another one that I feel like has really kind of found an audience. People are loving it. The book looks phenomenal. How much more Sacrificers can we get?
Well, I think we're about halfway through the story now.
Okay.
And Sacrificers was, I remember, what was that I was watching? Wolf of Wall Street. And I'm just talking entirely stylistically. Was it Wolf of Wall Street? No, God damn it. What was the movie that inspired my... Anyway, I think it was a Scorsese. It was some movie where out of nowhere, I think it might have been Wolf of Wall Street, where Matthew McConaughey or... no, it was the Tarantino Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Okay.
Where in the middle of the movie, out of nowhere, hadn't been done to this point, Kurt Russell starts narrating. And he narrates really interesting but just punchy factoids. Well, this is when he found this, and Rick Dalton never went there. And he gets you through this character, gets you through like a year of his life. And it's just like boom, boom, boom. And it's never boring. I don't know where the fuck it came from. I never realized when we were transitioning into time warp narration, but you just smoothly go through that ride and come out the other end with the DiCaprio character has an Italian wife and he's back home. And it's so good. It's still all there. The story's all told. Now, you can't do a whole movie like that or a whole story. But The Sacrificers, as I was developing it, which was, looking at a lot of the sort of what I think is the biggest problem we have as a culture, which is wealth inequality. Everything stems from it. Everything stems from it. And how the sort of entitlement, and I won't get into the story, but a couple things that I witnessed with very rich people where I was like, oh, you're a fucking shitty person. Like, that's awful. Like, you think that you just, like, these people are trash. And there's the longer somebody's at the top and has the wealth or born into it, the sort of entitlement and the arrogance and the sort of ugliness that creates. The Sacrificers started off as a dark science fiction about, every family has to give one kid to the rich. And then that kid would be sort of taken to a giant chamber and drained of their joy for the rich to drink. And it was so dark, and it was so like, it was very gritty, Blade Runner-y, dark future, but the rich lived in these and I just felt like, I don't want to live in that world, I don't want to live in that world. So I decided to make it a fantasy. And I decided to make it a fantasy where I could buy that a little bit easier, and I was distanced from it. And that Vaseline worked. I think it worked a lot for the readers too. You have to trust your guts on that. And then I decided that I would tell it where the first story was like the way that a regular film would be told, like the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where the story's just being told. There's no narration. You're just watching a story. And then I would get into the fairy book, sort of the fairy tale of it all. Once upon a time, there was a princess who was born in a kingdom. And I've never let myself play like that. So where like on issue 7, I started the third person narration. And it was watching that Tarantino film that I was like, oh, you can do anything. You can just be free. You can just, as long as it works narratively, the reader will go along with you on that journey. You just can't put a big headline or a spotlight on it. It just has to kind of start happening. and then I pull in and out of that a little bit, but I've got this huge outline. I think it'll probably, we're about halfway through, so it goes into the 20s. Max is one of these like guys that I think we started to break him. Like the first trade is 6 issues, and they're all oversized, so it's basically like 7 issues, and he's just every panel is just like, this is the best I can do, and so I think we're going to take a little this current arc, the third arc ends at issue 15, and then I think we'll take 4 or 5, maybe 6 months, and just let Max have a breath, and I'll give him scripts, and he can go back to building them. Because again, when I look at the hardcovers, I go, in the end, what matters is that it's fucking amazing, and that Max can one day go, here's a giant book or 2 giant books or whatever of the very best I'm capable of, and as long as I can keep people invested, and they'll buy us a little time. That's sort of the plan.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk the seasons a bit. This is a book that you have said is very special to you, and obviously, we can't talk much about it, but we can set it up. But I'd love for you to go into what you're hoping fans take away from this book as they start this journey with you.
I'm just hoping that people, like the way that grommets, nobody knew they needed that or wanted it, and it blew up, and this really, it's like the same with Sacrificers. Very nice to see, like, you could look at that and go, oh, it's a story about a young pigeon in a world against the moon and the sun, like these are big swings, but everything I've done has been. And I hope that anybody who's, especially if you've listened to this podcast this long, if you've made it this far into this, then you must care about what I want you to read. And I think that the important thing about Seasons is that it's a really quiet and whimsical horror story. And the horror builds slowly, and it doesn't really make a big appearance for a while. But when it does make an appearance, I think it's really unique, and I think it's very sort of, it's very visual. And it's Paul and Mateus are just allowed to kind of, a lot of the same pacing in what I did in Righteous Thirst, and that it allows itself to have muscular restraint, where if you're looking for just a bunch of information and all the characters are and there's no mystery, it's probably not going to be for you, because it's going to take its time and go there. It's going to unfold slowly. It's all show, no tell. The entire thing is very layered and demands just, that you can hit that wavelength. It was inspired a lot by Miyazaki and Winsor McCay and Tintin and a little David Lynch thrown in there. And something that was at the same time, the challenge, and Paul and I talked a lot about it, was how do you make something with all of that and still make it sort of like young audience level, where you're not having to make it salacious or curse or show nudity or have an axe go through somebody's head while they're having sex, and is there a way to tell this in that world where it's like I could hand it to my kids and still make it creepy and still make it smart and still do something with it that makes people uncomfortable and says something about the world we live in and all these things, and I feel so good like we did that. Like, we're on issue 6 right now in production, and I'm just dying for people to see it. It's one of those things that you want to broadcast the energy to the humans and be like, please read this comic book. I think it's what I think we need more of. It's nobody writes them like they used to, so it may as well be me. And I hope that people will take a swing and try it out, because the first issue is 40 pages for the same price. We're just dumping our asses into this thing to try to make the gravity center of creator-owned comic books maintain the love that, keep us so creatively fulfilled.
I think that's going to do it for us, man. We did it. We made it to the end of another one. So we'll do it again in 10 years.
In 10. Just smash cut. I'm like Santa Claus with a big beard. What is
You've recently reemerged on social a little bit. You're getting a little more involved. We've seen you on Instagram and things like that. Is that really the main place where folks can keep updated with your stuff? Obviously, in addition to following all the Fine Image social media accounts.
It is, yeah. And I don't fuck with the like listen to my opinions about everything every 5 minutes. It's sort of, I realized that Twitter went from being fun and goofy to this just bathing in indulgence and narcissism and like what I think and I'm outraged and just shut the fuck up. We all got our opinions. I don't need it, so I can't fuck with those. I will hit you with ads for my books on those. I will abuse your eyeballs, but I won't also do the like engagement. You're not gonna have. You want to know what I think about it? It's hidden in my books. But yeah, Instagram I love, and my wife had a big Instagram following with her. She did a children's clothing line and interior decorating stuff, and it blew up. Whenever Instagram was big, 10, 12 years ago. Right. And she kept saying like, Twitter seems to make you really unhappy. Like, why don't you just go to Instagram? I'm like, because Instagram's gonna probably not make me that unhappy. Don't you know? This is mother's milk. Give me your negative energy. I'm used to that, but Instagram was it. Yeah, I'm sure there's still plenty of bullshit on there and everywhere. But I follow comedians and skateboarders and chefs and artists, and they put up a post, and I go, oh, that's nice. Or an old '80s video pops up for a Cure song I like. It's nice. So that's where I decided to use that platform to keep talking about my stuff, and that's where I do it.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, Rick, thank you again. And for everyone listening, make sure you check out the seasons coming out very, very shortly.
Thanks, Jim.
Well, there we go. We made it to the end of the first episode of Let's Talk Comics. Thank you so much for listening this far. Usually this is where people just click off and say, all right, I'm going to go do my thing or listen to the next podcast or whatever, because this is usually where like the business happens, right? And that's where the business is going to be in this part of the show. If you want to support the show, there are two very, very good ways that you can do so. One, leave a 5-star review on iTunes. It helps us get into the algorithm. It helps our discoverability. And if I read your review on air, which I plan on doing in these upcoming weeks, I will mail you a sticker. All you got to do is just shoot me an email and say, hey, you read my review, and I'll get it out there. The second one is tell a friend. Are you in a Discord community? Are you on Reddit? Does your local comic book shop? You guys talk about comic podcasts and things that you listen to? Tell them about this show. Tell them, hey, I found this new show. I really liked it. I think you would dig it. Why don't you give it a shot? And then you can send them over to letstalkcomics.com, which should actually redirect you to the podcast page over at imagecomics.com, which I have to give a big thank you to Eric Stevenson and Robert Kirkman for, because without them, this show does not come back. I've wanted to do the show in a number of different ways. I obviously wanted to do it when I was at Comic Book, but there was it was weirdness, and I didn't want to give Let's Talk Comics to Comic Book. I would have had to give it to them, and it was very near and dear to me. And so to be able to do it here and do it in Image with their blessing, it means a lot more, because I get to talk to creators who I worked with at Marvel and DC, not only about their careers, about that stuff and things like that, but now who are launching books at Image. I started in April 2024. We had a banger year of launches. 2025 is going to be an even bigger year of launches. And so this really felt like the right time to get this out at the top of the year into the ethos and podcastosphere or whatever. And so I really do appreciate that. Obviously got to give big thanks to Rick Remender for spending so much time with us, and a big, again, thanks to you. The social stuff is neither here nor there. You can find Let's Talk Comics on all those weird social platforms, Blue Sky, Threads, Twitter, whatever. You can find me at Jim Biscardi at Let's Talk Comics. And that's it. That's the business. Thank you for making it this far. And I won't drag this on too much longer, so go out, go buy some comics, go read some comics, because we will keep on talking about comics.